Faith in humans. Give me something to believe in. Earth below me, sky above me, fire within me. Brought to you by UPRN Network. I'm Trish Moe, and this is The Missing Piece. Good evening, everyone. It is Monday, May 9th, and this is The Missing Piece. I am your host, Trish Moe, and we're broadcasting live from New Orleans, 105.3 FM and United Public Radio Network. I'd like to thank Carnation for sponsoring the first hour of my show, as well as thank you all for showing up and listening to me. So tonight, I'll start with a few things. Last week, I had such an amazing time with Ray Bishop, the author of Outlaw. Again, I want to thank him. And that was amazing to hear his story. I had a lot of fun with that. So I'll definitely have him on again in the future. And as far as moving forward with the missing piece, I'm going to randomly, have nights that I just tell part of my story so you all can get to know me as well. So um, there's a lot of exciting stuff in the future, as far as my guests and the show and the station. I'm also going to be on Horsefly Chronicles next week, and that airs at 7 p.m. Central Time, right before my show. And then you can just stay tuned. I'm going to have um, Flood and his crew from XV Planis, as well as Jill Weaver, so we can wrap up our Sally House investigation. Finally, I promise I'm going to get that done. So that's exciting. I'm also going to have a lot of, um, I'm probably going to show a lot of video clips from that as well. And some of what I found in Atchison. Atchison has a lot of history here in Kansas, going back to the Civil War era and lot of history, a lot of history. Lewis and Clark, gosh, Bonnie and Clyde, there's so many people that have come through the Midwest here. So that's something to look forward to. Um, and so tonight, first of all, I kind of want to, I always, a lot of the information I'm going over tonight is things I've channeled recently. Um, in that have shown up in my life or had a lot to do with something in my life. And so I want to share that because it has to do with the world as well and the current events. And so uh, today in history, interesting enough, I always look every day. I look up famous people's birthdays. I've done this for a very long time, as well as historical events. Um, Not all good, not all bad, just because um, it helps us remember how we got here, how the world was formed, and so um, in our own towns, in our own communities, as well as countries and the world itself, or even the universe. So that's something. Today, May 9th, 1960, the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, approved the world's first commercially produced birth control pill, which is a huge topic right now, as everyone knows, with the controversy over abortion laws. So that was actually the development of the pill was commissioned by pioneer Margaret Sanger and funded by heiress Catherine McCormick. And they first opened a clinic in the United States in 1916. They hope to encourage the development of more practical and effective alternatives um, than what were available in use at the time. And so in the early 1950s, which years later, it was Gregory Pincus, a biochemist at Worcester, found. Worcester. That reminds me of the Worcester Foundation for Experimental Biology, and John Rock, who was a doctor at Harvard Medical School. They both collaborated and began work on the birth control pill, and it used synthetic hormones. They initiated those in 1954. So it was 1960 on this day that the FDA approved that, granting greater reproductive freedom to American women. So that's pretty big in our history. Um, and then there's quite a few other what else happened today that I found? It was um, wild. It was Buffalo Bill. Sorry, I was going to say Wild Bill Hickok, but it was Buffalo Bill actually who began on this day his famous Wild West show in London. It opened in London for Queen Victoria, and it gave Britain's people a look into the entire, the romanticized Wild West. It was a show, it was a stage show, and he actually got his name because he was a buffalo hunter for the railroads and a scout for the army at the time, the U.S. Army. A lot of people don't know that. I live here on the prairie in Oz, so that's a huge part of our history. And in 1883, he staged the first outdoor stage show. They called it an extravaganza in North Platte, Nebraska. He called it the Wild West Rocky Mountain and Prairie Exhibition. It was a 4th of July show. When it was a success, he realized he could evoke uh, all of the mysticism of the Wild West more effectively by going outdoors and having his performances instead of being cramped and inside. So he could also have larger exhibitions. So I've seen a few of these reenacted at different places, and it's really neat because they utilize different buildings and even horses and things like that have have their little Wild West gunfights and such. It was kind of like a circus depicting life in the Wild West. So he performed it all over the nation, sometimes to crowds as big as 20,000 people, which was huge at the time. Um, he reenacted the Pony Express, Custer's Last Stand, and the Battle of Little Bighorn. Um, it was Buffalo Bill Cody who discovered Annie Oakley, a young Ohio woman who earned her nickname by her ability as a sharpshooter. She was called Little Sure Shot um, because she was able to shoot a cigar out of an assistant's mouth, which is pretty accurate for the time. So um, after that, one of the most notorious, one of my favorite um, crimes back in the 1600s, actually, 1671 on May 9th, Captain Blood attempted to steal the crown jewels in London. Thomas Blood, he was an Irish adventurer, better known as Captain Blood. He stole the crown. Well, he was captured for attempting to steal the crown jewels from the Tower of London. Um, he was deprived of his estates in Ireland after the restoration of the English monarchy in 1660, and he plotted to take back Dublin Castle from supporters of King Charles II in 1663. Um, and so when he tried to steal the crown jewels in 1671, they were remade into their original shape because Charles II thought it would be a good idea to keep them with him at all times. And so Eastwell was supposed to steal these new jewels, but he got caught right before he could execute his plan. And so on May 9th, 1671, it was Thomas Blood, Captain Blood, who under the disguise as a priest, convinced the keeper of the jewel house to hand over his pistols. So simple, yet effective. Um, he was then joined by three other criminals and they forced their way in. So, although they managed to escape with a flamboyant armory unexpectedly, um, it alarmed the tower guards. So, one of the men shoved the royal orb down his pants and tried to shrink the crown with a mallet. I don't see this ending very well. And so, the tower guards captured all four of the thieves, obviously. Blood was taken to see King Charles, and the king was so impressed by his audacity to do that that he didn't punish him. Far from it, actually. He restored his estates and in Ireland and made him a member of his court with an annual pension. Sounds like a lot of modern governments, actually, come to think of it. Hmm. Yes. So, um, other than that today, um, what else happened? There's so many neat birthdays and such that I want to look at. But um, now I painted. I had I'm an artist as well, and I painted I was gonna bring it picture of depicting time flying. So it has like a space background and actual clocks flying. And so when I was getting something off my bookshelf yesterday, and I have this ornament that is a clock with wings, and it fell off that literally almost flew off the shelf and hit me. And so I started thinking about black holes because I've been thinking about black holes a lot. That's been popping into my intuition lately a lot. And and then this article popped up on my phone. Um, about NASA and the X-ray binary stellar pairs, which is also interesting because I've intuitively been seeing um, binary pairs everywhere, So, um, but as far as time literally flying, the energy hungry empire might not need this is the quote they said um, they might not need to use stellar power and could bypass black holes in favor of extracting energy from them. They're the universe's ultimate energizer bunnies. And black holes are far more efficient at converting mass, which obviously um, mass and density, it converted as far as energy goes in the universe, as well as traveling, um, is very important in how I think we're going to utilize those in the future. Um, Vital, the scientist, um, he says what's impressive about that is their potential to control the microcosm as well. And so in present time, we can manipulate individual atoms via nanotechnology. But advanced alien physicists might experiment with elementary particles and even the very fabric of space-time. That's actually, I mean, that's profound in this day and age. That's huge. Um, just how far we've advanced, as far as humankind goes. And so looking towards the future, after they master control over space time, which I mean obviously is still going to take some adjustments here. Uh, a super civilization might want to fabricate their own black holes for a variety of tasks, to include waste disposal, starship propulsion, hypercomputing, and maybe even time travel. So that's interesting. That's a lot to think about. As far as the X-ray binary stellar pairs go, NASA's Chandra X-ray telescope has found an overabundance of these systems within several light years of the galactic center. So, which would be, the central bulge of our galaxy, basically, which should be the home to the oldest civilizations because of its ancient stellar population. So, um, it's been widely known for years, as far as nanotechnology goes and nanoparticles. Um, the According to the AFCEA, who've been these companies have been using this technology to create inhalable particles that can self-assemble in the human body. Now, I automatically start thinking sci-fi movies, um, and uh, because that's what this literally sounds like, something out of a movie. Um, if those were to gather, if these particles would gather in the human body and assemble themselves into separate into a separate mechanical unit, basically, and then they could start to operate as an individual cell, which is insane and crazy. I mean, so there's two things that, there's many advantages to these nanoparticles, obviously, to the extent of finding and healing things such as tumors and cancer in the body, um, other genetic diseases potentially, but also on the flip side, there's always everything has duality, everything has a balance, and everything can also be utilized as a weapon. So that's another thing to think about, And so when I'm reading food labels and I see, um, on the back, I'm not sure exactly. A lot of them say different things. Um, it'll say nanotechnology or something, under after the ingredients, nanoparticles included in this food, nano what, and and that's something that's interesting to think about, because then you're actually ingesting it. You're eating it in that point. This is speaking of it being inhaled, these particles being inhaled. So, um, there's a lot going on in the world as far as that. But that's what brought me to, a few it was probably 2 weeks ago, and I have it on my YouTube channel, um, Tayama Trish Mo. I have a channeling I did of I kept seeing something dangerous about the color yellow. And I'm like, what does this have to do with anything else in the world? What does yellow, and I also mentioned yellow cab, which I figured out that one on Chasing Prophecy 2 weeks ago. I think it was 2 weeks ago. We had Jerry Sargent, and um, he talked about in his story, being in a car accident with a cab driver. And so that one I kind of, um, associated as far as synchronicities, going back to one of the spirits that was involved in that accident, um, was trying to communicate with me prior to him being on the show. Um, and and so that was one thing, but I kept seeing South Dakota, and I didn't know what that had to do with anything at all. Uh, but I'll get to that, because obviously usually takes me about 2 weeks to figure out what some of these messages mean. So, um, I said yellow, South Dakota, something about a cab, and this goes back last week. I didn't have time, but I started talking about the, U.S. government's Project Naomi. Um, and there's been, I don't even know how many projects they've had that have been, made public, in the last, well, probably since about the 1960s. They had a lot of trials back then, and they released all of those documents. But a lot of them, most recently, there's been more evidence and more information that has come out. And so one of the major things with Project Naomi was this was in I want to this was April of 19 well, this report came out in July of 1975, but it was referring to these experiments that were performed in 1963 and a survey, and it was between and these can be found in the government archives, by the way. This was the summary of the report on the CIA investigation of MK Naomi, which obviously is a sub project of all of the MK Ultra experiments that were also released. So the initial identification of the relationship between the CIA and the Army Biological Laboratory, this one was at Fort Detrick, sorry. And they required further investigation into it, and that was April of 1963. Um, in response to repetitive appeals of the DCI that all past activities, which might now be considered questionable, be brought to the attention of the public and the agency. And so they hired people to do more research. They hired their own investigators to do research on this, and they found that there was approximately $90,000, which you know this was 1963, so that was a lot of money funded towards this, spent on this for what they have, and it was in quotations, for the maintenance of the biological warfare capability projects. And this statement appeared so important that they tried to determine its significance. And so the office of the technical service there, the OTS as they call it, they didn't feel it. They said they thought there was only a small effort made on any research into what had actually been taken place at these facilities. And um, they were assured that the entire project had been terminated years prior, and the nature of all of these, they started digging into the records and found all of these other fund transfers to Fort Detrick. Now so all of that sparked a new investigation, enabling the OTS to recall the proper files from the record center, and that's when these two MK Naomi files were retrieved from the Office of Logistics. So this collection confirmed the nature of the project as reported, and the informants, the number of people involved, all of that information, and the additional cause for concern in the activity. Um, so what they found, it's not. I don't even know if it's no. I mean, obviously, nothing's really known as far as that goes. But it's not known whether these materials they found had been destroyed along with the Army's stockpiles in response to the presidential directives of November 1969 and February 1970. But the unsigned memo raising the question of these materials maintained at Fort Detrick posed the option of having it stored in a commercial laboratory. That's scary in itself. So it was the impression of those in the OTS who were familiar with the project. The material, in fact, had been destroyed, but no records confirming it could be found. So they searched these laboratory storage facilities, and this search turned up, this is crazy, 11 grams of shellfish toxin, right? You're like, what would you use that for? 6 milligrams of cobra venom, crazy, right? But no other materials were discovered. And so um, they, ki- regardless, they opened up a full investigation of this project. Um, that was passed by the staff members of the Rockefeller Commission and to the White House handling intelligence community investigation matters. So in June, Senator Church was informed by Rod Hills of the White House that a sensitive activity was under investigation. Now, what they uncovered from this initial search um, it only contained a small number of documents. They they gave interviews to employees, obviously, who didn't have much knowledge of any of these things. They were all voluntary. Um, some of them knew of the project. A number of them were retired. Um, as far as the people that had been more deeply involved, and these people were the people that were more deeply involved, and why it became such a time sensitive matter as far as time flies, because a lot of these people that were retired are well into their 80s by this time. So we're losing information of the only people that witnessed a lot of these things that went on. And so one of included in the latter category, Tom Karamesson, Cornelius Roosevelt, and Ray Trickler. Um, those three, they were listed as having information contained in the IG's report on assassination planning and information developed by a DoD investigation initiated as a result of conversations with the White House about the matter. So this information, this was still back then on this 1970 report. Um, it was only recently received and had not been widely incorporated. Now, the Special Operations Division of Fort Detrick, um, their involvement in the facility, um, they were the division apparently responsible for developing these agents and toxins. And so the principal, customer of its activities, it says, appears to have been the U.S. Army Special Forces. So with the development of suitable agents and delivery mechanisms, um, using paramilitary situations, they there was so much activity. It had started in 1948, although no records existed going back that far. Nobody's found them to this day. Um, they asserted that it was abolished by 1970 or 71, and the operation was terminated. However, you keep going. Their access to this, it kept coming up. There kept being funding that was funneled different places. The initial funding relating to this one was $200,000 a year. In that was the fiscal year 1958. No, I apologize. 1958 was the high point, 390,000, and then dwindled to 75,000 a year, and that was in the late 1960s. So they don't have good records of where this funding went or how it was used. Um, but It was estimated in 1970 to have been somewhat more than $3 million, which is a lot of money going to this project. So, um, the activity was to the maintenance of a stockpile of incapacitating and lethal agents, so in operational use. Um, and why this is there were only 3 agency officers, who were cleared for access to the Fort Detrick activities. Um, it was managed first by the biology branch and later by the chemistry branch, and you're probably asking how this directly relates to me or anything in my life. Well, um, these documents proved. Let me get to the peculiar CIA interest where they, in the later years that they found of these stockpiles, they were. Here's how they they projected to disseminate disseminate the agents into the air. So one of here's some of the examples: a cigarette lighter or a cigarette case, um, set to release these particles when lighted, a fountain pen, a dart launcher, an engine head bolt designed to release the agent when heated, a fluorescent light starter to activate the light and then release the agent. Um, Available records don't indicate whether or not these were developed specifically for the CIA, or if they had, intended this specifically for the Department of Defense. So, um, they said there was a meeting in June of 1952. They stated they had yet to use any of these. They hadn't worked on how they were going to do this, but it was such things as gum, cigarette lighters, wristwatches, fountain pens, rings, um, which is crazy. That it's like a movie. So the shellfish toxin. Um, there was a presidential order requiring the destruction of this material, as well as the 8 milligrams of cobra venom, um, and it was in Vault B10, and so it was the discovery of these materials in May, so that would have been a month earlier, changed, and it was only available to the chief of chemistry branch, his secretary, and OTS security officers. It was under 24-hour guard on June 13th, as far as the vault goes. And the freezer in which the toxin was found is located under one of the workbenches in the laboratory. And so the Fort Detrick material was the only thing in this freezer. Um, It was in 2 one-gallon cans along with several smaller containers. There were no labels on the cans, and the only thing they had a folded piece of paper, um, on the top of each container, uh, as far as what material was contained in these canisters. So, um, the shellfish toxin was, according to this, put in the freezer in February 1970, and the cobra venom in 1961. The shellfish toxin was packaged in several different forms, including individual doses and tablet form. So that's really interesting. Um, when they followed up on it, um, the it was the officer Boston who found the material in a freezer. And what was profound about this is that they found it hard to understand that this material could be stored there in this, under this bench for so long without anyone being aware of it. Because that was in he retired in 1972. So this is like 20 years later that it was still there. It was and nobody knew about it. Um and they just said there was no occasion that arose to investigate the contents of the freezer. So and there had been no reported functioning difficulties with the freezer during this entire period. Um, After they found it in the vault, a complete inventory was taken of the entire facility, which led to a larger number of dangerous chemicals and drugs of various types um, from past programs that past projects. And they had developed harassment materials for crowd control. Um, or meetings disruption, crop contamination programs, small amounts of several other lethal preparations, um, and two of them are known to have been obtained by the agency for testing at Fort Detrick. And so nothing's known about the other ones. Um, there were also a number of L pills, which they called them, issued to the agents or pilots, um, formerly pilots, for suicide purposes in the event of capture. So um, these officers, though, had they stuck by their word that they had no recollection of any of these things being stored there. Um, and so it's hard to follow the path of any of these things because it's like everyone who knows something either all of a sudden forgets or they're lying, or who knows, they probably with advancements like that they could have had their memory erased. um but as far in the future of this, they had there's no record associating the project with actual operations, which is good. um they had discussions in with people involved in the project indicating um this is crazy. It reminds me of like that vampire movie Lost Boys. um but they had hand launchers with darts loaded with dog incapacitants that may have been delivered for use in Southeast Asia. Now, this was, obviously lung. And they indicated that some of the material, the crop spoilants, may have also been employed. No direct connections of any type of assassination planning have ever been found. Um, but they did lead to later investigations from Fort Detrick of even like the Castro case. So um and when they would leave these facilities, they also had a dart launcher which would uh re-alert the dogs, these guard dogs and stuff. So um there was a time in how what this triggered in my own life. Um, I lived, it was in Manhattan, Kansas, actually, and there's obviously a military base there. Um, when my own dog, um, all of a sudden, there was weird. If And it happened to I had all of my pets with me one time. I had my 2 dogs and a cat with me in my car, and they were barking at a person walking up to my vehicle, and all of a sudden, they completely it's like they just passed out, completely went to sleep, and something was communicating with me at that time, like, telepathically, as far as but I considered it uh, that one almost had a human undertone because they were very, I don't want to say cocky in the verbiage they used, the language they spoke, and said something to the effect of them having to debilitate my dogs for because they were a distraction and they were creating a disturbance, because this was at night. So I've read this and seen this occasionally in other mill lab stories and things like that, or even I've even seen it later, years later, on movies and such. But I was never aware that that the government actually had something like this. So that's really interesting, as far as the purpose of those. Now, moving forward, and how this connects with Roswell, and I will get to that as far as uh, there's another project, and where they would use these. Um, there's a book called Secrets, the Black Vault, and it was mentioned. You've probably seen in the news lately. This was where the color yellow came from. I realized because um, I started reading about the yellow dyes, yellow dye 5, yellow color 5, that's used in a lot of food, and used in a lot of candy. It's actually known to cause um, different diseases and possibly even cancer. And so it was years ago when I got Lyme disease that I stopped buying. Um, food and things like that that contained any unnatural dyes or colors or preservatives because I became sensitive to those. And so I started getting into all of these cereals, and many of them are popular children's cereals. Now, what I found with this led back to specifically General Mills cereal. And and this book led to actually a lot of these documents, these declassified documents. Um, it was called Project Mogul, and this was August of 1949. Excuse me. Um, when the Soviets exploded their first atomic device, this is when this project was launched. It was not in operation. Um, the explosion was detected by a specially equipped Air Force B-29 aircraft, and there were such strict or stringent security enforcements put into place. They were strictly based on a need to know basis. Uh, I mean, it went down to maximum security clearance, secluded laboratories, code words, etc. Um, but either way, the nature of these operations remained shrouded in secrecy, and what they did was deployed giant trains of balloons, over 30 research balloons, with experimental sensors strung together, stretched more than 600 feet, and they could not be disguised or hidden from the public. Obviously, I mean, people knew about this, um, and it because they they had to be launched during the daylight, and um, oftentimes back then, these were in fact mistaken for UFOs. Now, this is 1949. So, um, a lot of the recovery crews of these balloons They listened for broadcasts of UFO reports because that actually assisted them in tracking their operations. And then they would go find the balloons and get their data. And the way this relates to the U.S. military and even Roswell in July of 1947, obviously, um, it was General Mills had a secret contract with the U.S. government for collecting data in these weather balloons. And so most people are aware that um, the flying saucer crash in Roswell, the government had changed their story multiple times um, and concluded that it was weather balloons. And if that was the case, they would have in fact been under the cereal maker, General Mills, contract with the government. Um, so this is either way, it's still disturbing. Excuse me, because what's a cereal company doing? Performing research and experiments on, on a government level. You know what? That's crazy. And so from that, of course, sprung up a new project. Um, this technology was actually created by General Mills at the time, but that went to Project Genetrix. Um, it was another prime example of the military intelligence gathering um, using balloon technology. Excuse me. Um, so now, when I went further into this, when I dug deeper into these reports, this was all at the time authorized by President Eisenhower. They used the balloons with cameras to gather photographic intelligence um, over not only our own airspace, but other countries, Soviet, Chinese airspace, because it provided valuable data. Now, oftentimes these were damaged or shot down or whatever happened. Um, but by the end, they had recovered most of them. General Mills is mentioned more than 60 times in the Roswell report. Um, so on the fact versus fiction in the New Mexico desert. And there are multiple references to their extensive balloon research and programs. So obviously, it was an important aspect of the military intelligence gathering, and they they not this that just proves that General Mills not only did they help create the technology that was used, but they also later went on to make biological weapon delivery systems that would be carried by its own balloons. And so um, in these programs, General Mills focused on the milling and the grinding. Um, there's specific grains, there's specific sugar, things like that that make up the recipes, and they made it into um, that's what make up all of their different brands. I don't I have an entire list. I made a presentation actually on safe, most recent safe cereal brands. Um, Nature's Path, Cascadian Farms, a lot of those do not include all of the dangerous sugar, all of the dangerous dyes. I get a lot of those, especially right now because of um, the dyes lead to inflammation, autoimmune disorders, things like that. And so with Lyme disease, obviously I can't eat things like that. And I don't want my children to. So um, but these were specifically, this contract was made um, for better research in the classified, uh, leading to biological weapons delivery systems. And so this was early 1960. Um, they said it covers major areas of activity during the first 3 months of the program, on dissemination of solid and liquid biological weapon agents, delivered um, from a source of high speed, low flying aircraft. Now, we have talked about this numerous times, especially in the Midwest. I know definitely in Kansas, we have chemtrails, and we've always been told that, these are all to help the crops and all of this information, but now it makes me wonder. And when I first moved back here and I started noticing all the health, I'll probably look into this further, actually, because all the health problems of a lot of, especially a lot of children, you see a lot of kids with like cleft palates, things like that. And it reminds me of, full on Aaron Brockovich, the movie, um, where the water's contaminated, and it starts affecting people that live in the area. It affects, there's people with cancer and things like that that it leads to. Well, why this is so alarming is because all of the water in the Midwest, um, Kansas, Missouri rivers, things like that, they lead down to the Gulf of Mexico, which is obviously, if the water from this part of the country is infected and poisoned with these different chemicals, it would lead to the ocean, which in turn affects everybody else in the world. So, not to mention the soil and everything else. So, aside from just the cereal, so, um, it's a problem, and I think more people are becoming aware of the effects of these things, and so um, now it says later in this report, despite the military contracts, the work of General Mills would eventually turn its focus back to the consumer. Um, we know them in the 21st century as a food maker and not a biological weapon research facility. So they've grown to employ approximately 38,000 people, net sales topping $15.5 billion. Their brands include Betty Crocker, Hamburger Helper, Cheerios, Pillsbury, Wheaties, just to name a few. And to all of that, it was their contributions to the secret balloon program, spying on the Soviet Union, and the development of biological weapon delivery systems that, at least in part, helped pave the way to what they are today. So keep that in mind the next time you go looking for breakfast and walk down the cereal aisle. So, um, other things with General Mills, they eventually led to truth serums. That's, post World War II era. Um, and it was always a fear, if the American soldiers were captured, or intelligence officers, that they would be injected with these biological weapons and be forced to, the I guess, withhold they would be powerless in withholding knowledge, um, of things getting into the enemy's hands. So they interrogators could extract battle plans, troop locations, weapon capabilities, all kinds of things. So Um, Now, what's interesting um, is all of that led to Project Chatter, but the disturbing thing um, was a later project with Lieutenant Savage. Um, you know, he was the one that eventually in these reports talked about the details of what these different projects had, as far as they were similar to LSD, um, and which could control the normal expression of they were used for control of subjects and depressed patients. So it had a psychic effect. It could manifest increased emotional um, abilities, dissociation, imagery, um, different euphorias on mental patients. Um, and they were actually in part of it. They were determining whether it could be used, be of value in the treatment of depression. So they tested these depressed patients and noticed that a definite physiological effect could be observed. Um, and this was over a period of a month, except when it had to be interrupted for medical reasons. So um, these are these were human subjects with LSD. So again, this was back in the 70s, and what they caused various elevations of anxiety, especially regarding warfare interrogations. It's LSD. It wasn't considered to be lethal. Doesn't have a color, odor, or taste. Um, since the effect on this, it was temporary, in contrast to other nerve agents. There are obviously strategic advantages for using it, but there's so much. The physiological properties were capable of rendering entire groups of people, including military forces, indifferent to their surroundings and situations. It also interfered with, it could interfere with an entire group's planning, judgment, um, a- create apprehension, uncontrollable confusion, and terror. So that's pretty scary that one little substance released into the air could have that effect on so many people. And it's known to affect the mind, um, similar to mescaline. Um, Very minute quantities create serious mental confusion, sensual disturbances, render the mind temporarily susceptible to many types of influences. So, um, can also produce individual characteristics of schizophrenia, visual or auditory hallucinations, dizziness, nausea, dilation of the pupils, all kinds of things. And there's never, obviously the truth of the extent of how these were used and how these were tested um, is probably never going to be made public. Um, but it can also, they used it for eliciting true um, statements from subjects under its influence during interrogation. But it also revived memories of past experiences that people may have forgotten due to trauma or whatever else. Um, and in at least one case, there was complete amnesia of the events during the effective period. So to date, there's no antidote nor specific counteragent available. Um, it could render the mind temporarily susceptible to many types of influences, and that was clearly the goal of the CIA at the time. So to allow the human mind to be infiltrated by interrogators or handlers and make the subject do what they wanted. Um, Now, something new began to emerge as far as the various tests during this that became Project Artichoke. Um, it was a precursor to the program Project Bluebird, which everybody, has also been affiliated with the Roswell, the UFO crashes. And Project Bluebird was directly correlated to the subject of assassination. So, um, this was top secret when it was released in January of 1954. Um, and and it specifically referred to, wow, that they were really looking into how to create an assassin who would involuntarily kill someone. And it appeared so because they had many hypothetical questions listed in this report. And um, there were asterisks filling in the blank. And it also listed different ethnic backgrounds. Um, but this goes back to the author in this on the Black Vault, as far as the Truth Serum chapter, mentions the 1962 film The Manchurian Candidate, um, with Angela Lansbury and Frank Sinatra. It was about the CIA exploring questions of hypnotic and drug-induced assassins. Um, so if you look into this goes, then you think about all of the um, Kennedy and because if this was in the early 60s, late 50s. So this was before um, the Kennedy assassination. This was before um, any of them, as far as the Reagan attempt or any of those. So, um, and they said that these subjects, everything's an asterisk in this, um, was formerly in employ but had since terminated, is now employed with the blank government, according to available information. Um, Access to the subject would be extremely limited, probability limited to a single social meeting. Um, wow. They said because the subject is a heavy drinker, it was proposed that the individual could be surreptitiously drugged through the medium of an alcoholic cocktail at a social party. Um, Artichoke applied, and the subject induced to perform the act of attempted assassination at some later date. All of the above was to be accomplished at one involuntary, uncontrolled social meeting. After the act was performed, um, it was assumed that the subject would be taken into custody of the blank government and disposed of. Um, this is crazy because this is all hypothetical, of course. Um, but why would it be necessary to include that? Like, why would you need to include any type of quotations as far as um, who the people actually were if it was just hypothetical, right? You wouldn't. So, and why this brings to question in my own life. There have been numerous times um, I can think of so many, and this is not just happened to me. You will see this in many people's um, accounts of gang stalking, um, things like that. If you've ever heard of that, and that's basically, let me pull up the gang stalking definition for those of you that aren't familiar with it. Um, um, it is the belief in which those affected believe they are being followed, stalked, harassed by a large number of people. Um, they claim that their lives are disrupted um, by organizations or groups with the intent of causing them harm or distress in their lives. And so, what you'll see in a lot of these gang stalking um, cases are, and you know, there's different people that make this, that have said this in numerous reports. Bob Lazar is one that nobody believed, but then all of a sudden, after he made these reports, he couldn't access records in his life. He couldn't, um, you know, there were a lot of things that happened. They would see people following them, you know, unmarked vans, things like that, and because he had made information public, I guess, but not always. You know, there's been tons of people on our entire network. You'll see guests on other shows that say things like, um, they've had helicopters follow them, they've had um, people follow them, they've many different things happen. But as far as this goes, and being able to affect someone through drugs or alcohol and the way they interact with you has happened in my life on numerous occasions. Now, question to be argued is whether they're being influenced by something like this, something like a substance by the government or somebody else, or as far as you know, me being a medium, if it's an influence, if it's literally a spiritual warfare and they're being influenced by another something else, you know, possession, things like that is a theory. In either case, every time this has ever happened, I mean, this goes down to even having people draw weapons on me or things like that and have no um, recollection of it after. And even by myself and other witnesses, and this is, like I said, this is only my account of these things happening. I've also seen similar accounts by other people. And um, the subjects often look, when they're doing these things, when they're trying to harm someone, um, they look almost catatonic, like almost like they're drugged, almost like they're either drugged or they have no. It reminds me of somebody else remote viewing or being able to control and manipulate them. And I think, and that's what I was getting at with these things. Why this connects to Roswell. I recently saw, it was I think 2020. There are multiple reports on oh, also how that relates to Kansas. Before I move on from that, the way it relates to Kansas, the these reports, they use different funguses, anthrax, um, all these things that would penetrate the respiratory tract. And how they determined, this is interesting, how they determined where they would distribute these aerosol substances in these projects was based on the landscape. Now, I will tell you the dispersion of these, because it depended on the terrain and the, you know, the weather, things like that, how would be um, that would contribute to how far a substance was carried in the wind. Like Kansas, we don't have a lot of mountains. We don't have a lot of heavily treed areas or wooded areas. And so something in the wind would be carried a long ways. Um, and they did these related testing the vulnerability of the United States in pathogenic agents. And how destructive it would be. Um, the extent of damage in open air testing. So some of these things they also had to base their tests on the weather. That was dependent on that because obviously warmer days with wind, heat rises, it could carry something further. So the meteorologic conditions played a huge part in the disbursement. And they selected these places. Let me get to it. When they considered these test areas that most closely matched the meteorologic terrain population and physical characteristics of different countries. So, and in different seasonal conditions, meaning like winter, summer. Um, it became apparent that the upper Mississippi Valley was the best possibility for matching some of these, but the following cities were considered: Oklahoma City, Kansas City, Omaha, Cincinnati, St. Louis, Chicago, Minneapolis, and Winnipeg. So, of those, St. Louis and Minneapolis appeared to bracket the range of the best advantage because they had flat to rolling country, elevations generally below a thousand foot above sea level. St. Louis and Minneapolis qualified in those respects. And those cities are also on one or more rivers, which was another desired feature. Again, the rivers in the Midwest go all the way to the Gulf Coast. So, or I'm sorry, the Gulf Coast, the Gulf of Mexico. So, in the summer, it was considered similar to European countries. Um, Although there's parts, in northern North America, there's more mountainous regions. So they decided to test in Minneapolis, St. Louis, and Winnipeg for those, respectively. And this went down to avoid disclosing the exact nature and purpose of the operations, a cover story was devised. City officials were told that work was to obtain data pertinent to smoke screening of cities to prevent aerial observation. That was a study done by Stanford University, or a report done by Stanford University in 1952. Other test locations that were similar were San Francisco, California, and Panama City, Florida. Forests such as Chippewa National Forest in Minnesota, flatlands in Fort Wayne, Indiana, and Corpus Christi, Texas, deserts and unpopulated areas, um, Dugway Proving Ground in Utah were amongst some of the other locations. And a total of 160 tests using various simulants were conducted at 66 locations, both military and civilian targets in the United States, including Alaska and Hawaii and Canada. Um, I don't think the specific dates were disclosed. Um, but it makes you wonder, because even when we have these like the California wildfires and things like that, the ones in Colorado, that carries to my entire city was smoky because of those fires. So if something was administered, all that's how far it would travel and how many people it would affect. And um and so obviously the weather and everything else, all of those factors were absolutely a controlling factor in whether or not the test was permitted to start or continue. And some of the examples of the simulants used were Bacillus globigii, which is funny because I specifically channeled that a few weeks ago and put that on my Instagram account. Um, this was it's a fungus, B. globigii or Aspergillus, um, was released in San Francisco and New York subway systems, respectively, to study their dispersion. So, um, as well as zinc cadmium sulfide. So, those included, this was during 1950s and 1960s. Fort Wayne, Indiana, Minneapolis, and it was a very large area. It says covered the United States from the Rockies to the Atlantic and from Canada to the Gulf of Mexico. And that also had to do with the wind tunnel experiments. Now, going back to manipulation as far as the Roswell, the UFO crash, obviously I was born near there. I saw this show came on my TV one day. And it was called, they had new information regarding Roswell, and it was one of the main his name was, let me get there. His name was, well, first of all, Dr. Alan Hynek was one of the a huge contributor to the UFO research and evidence, as far as experiences, but it was Marcel. I apologize. I'm trying to find my note here. If that, um, it was the grandson who found this secret journal. It was the army officer, um, who found the secret journal. And what they ended up discovering was that he had, the start of his journal, he had written about the case and everything, just in a general manager, much like anyone would report, maybe, on paper or in a journal. And yes, Major Jesse Marcel, sorry. But then eventually it led to his handwriting, they stated, started to change. He also had, this was the first time this was reported, it was by Time in 97. It had, like they said, almost a cryptic language, that had coded messages that Marcel wrote about the crash at the time it happened. And he also listed like songs and movies and stuff from that era. They had it, and I watched on the newest that the grandson, Marcel's grandson, had this information again tested by she was like a forensics handwriting specialist, And they thought that wasn't, they concluded that that wasn't his handwriting, that it was done by a different person. But automatically, the first thing that popped in my head, and like I said, I don't watch TV really. I don't watch the news. I don't. So when something comes on my TV like this, it's usually has I'm meant to watch it. And when I was watching this, I thought, okay, if all of a sudden his handwriting changes, looks nothing like his, and he has all these messages that are completely what they thought to be irrelevant to the crash or coded in some way, um, was very similar to what psychics and mediums do as far as automatic handwriting or when we're channeling, because I'll go through notebooks and such, um, go back to something that's important, and it won't look like my handwriting at all. Um, but I did it. But sometimes I don't even remember the nature of the content as far as is what I was writing about. And that's similar to, if you ask any um medium or channeler or psychic, they have they'll say the same thing. And it can even go to the extent of being in a different, say I'm right-handed, I could use my left hand, or vice versa, because what happens is, if we're channeling through, if it, say even a spirit, say someone's past, someone's loved one, is channeling through me, using me as a conduit, um, my handwriting would literally look like that person's. So throughout history, I mean, this would change a lot of things as far as um, forensics goes, for example, because that doesn't mean it's a completely different person that necessarily um, wrote in that journal, or wrote whatever it is um, they're trying to test. It just means that it may not have been their consciousness, and that's important because we've often talked about the advancements in psychic awareness and mediumship. And when a person, um, say I want to focus on a specific um, deceased person, that's called our target. And when you put that energy of that target out into, the universe, the spirit world, um, it's like everything comes together to bring that in. But discernment is needed as well, because it's like the saying goes, if you if you invoke a rock, it will answer. Now, that does not mean that it is the rock itself answering. That means you don't always know what you're going to get when you do that. So when you're doing automatic writing, automatic shelling, um, it could be lower vibrational beings that, I don't know, maybe they have infinite time, so they might be entertained by answering these things. Or it could be a higher intelligence. It could absolutely be interdimensional beings. And there's groups, like global CE5, when they communicate, when they do, there's a lot of people that even have um channeled, that I've even interviewed numerous times, that have channeled art, channeled coded art. Um, Uma Shankari is one of them. Rupert Cortosh. Like there's numerous groups that do this, and it's been proven. And so that leads us to believe, when watching things like Lieutenant Marcel, that his journal may in fact have been messages from higher intelligence or interdimensional beings. So I think that's something that should absolutely be further examined. Um, and that's one of, um, sometimes as far as UFO investigations go, especially when it involves the military and things like that, especially when it has to do with Roswell and that whole area, since I grew up there, um, everybody takes such a scientific approach to it, but nobody really examines the nature of the entire area, the entire state, as far as the mysticism, the native beliefs, even the native backgrounds, things like that, because that plays a huge role in the messages coming across. And as far as mediumship goes, um, messages are different, even like to a say multiple people go to a supposedly haunted location or whatever. Each person at that location is going to get a different message because not everyone is on the same level of discernment or understanding. um, an older soul would be better able to understand um, more complicated messages, and but it's individual to that person, and this is across the board. So so even if you have a group invest like the global ce5s, um attempting to communicate with extraterrestrials and things like that, you absolutely should take into account every individual theirs perception of those messages, because they all mean something, and that's all part of the collective puzzle as a whole. And so that brings me to these government experiments and projects, on a maybe on a scientific level, because scientists obviously um, need proof for all of these things. It's often um, I was there too. Absolutely, that's the skeptical side, but on a much simpler level, when you start utilizing things that you know the magic, um people who use magic, or witches, or pagans, or natives, or anyone who, um this is very much an ancestral thing as far as collective thoughts. You don't need substances to make these things happen. It's already been, obviously, there's tons of accounts of people being used for remote viewing and things like that across the world. So even in abductions, and that's without the use of, um, it's with energy work, it's with hypnotism, it's with manipulation in those forms. And so I think that's going to be a big factor in the future of these things. And then as far as that goes, the same thing with handwriting, or the same thing with, um, then that brings into question all of these crimes that I research. A lot of times, if I'm led to like cold cases and such by different spirits, um, that makes you wonder who influenced, like serial killers and stuff. Who was it actually, that person who had a behavioral or a psychological problem, or were they being influenced by something else, whether it be a substance or spirit or psychological manipulation? And uh, that branches out into broader speculations of, even going down to mass shootings and things like that. Like, is that a spiritual warfare thing? Are they being manipulated by spirit, or are they quite literally, or interdimensional beings, or are they being manipulated by humans? And so I think, um, we've interviewed people who have perspectives from both sides, quite literally. And um, it's I'm going to be getting more into that because it has happened so many times in my life. It's absolutely happened in my life, you know, where I have someone who's a really good friend or even relative or something that all of a sudden shows up out of nowhere and you know doesn't look like themselves. Their eyes dilated, things like that, wants to fight me, wants to tells me to kill myself, something like that. And I think that's something that everyone should be aware of. You know, what if it's the person themselves that actually we need to get help for, or if we need to treat, obviously, the it's almost like the parasite effect. So, um, and that could have absolutely happened in the Roswell, or even in wars. It, if the research has been done on these, I think more information is needed on them because I mean you could manipulate an entire population of people. You could, and that's obviously that's been apparent throughout time based on subliminal messaging through even in marketing through colors and they used to use it in especially breakfast cereal. Who remembers? I remember from the 80s. Oh my gosh, every major breakfast cereal commercial on TV. You know, Kellogg's, Tony the Tiger. They're great. And what was the Life cereal? Life with Mike. Something about that. I remember all of those. So things like that absolutely leave an impression. Um, I think that's something to pay attention to because it could be used as a weapon or it could be used as a form of healing as well. And I'm going to get so much more into that in the future. Um, I know not as far as subliminal messaging, but as far as people go and their influence. And I once thought that it was just uh, the spirit realm, you know, people being possessed by these things and um, possessed by ghosts or spirits or whatever. And then I expanded that to more of a um, almost demonic. Um, Not really, because I don't. I think there's just lower or higher vibrational beings. Um, and then now begs a question of different substances. So that's I'm gonna. I also have noticed an entire all these crimes being committed lately that involve the mentioning of uh, people talking about Eli. Now, is that referring to the book of Eli? Is that referring to, you know, in a lot of these cases, it's like a demonic entity, Eli. But what is that? Like, where did that come from? Is it an interdimensional being posing as a demonic entity, which could possibly be true? And for what purpose? But in every one of these cases, you'll see the people do crazy things. They'll go and you know um, kill someone or do something, and then they like draw on the walls and have these, and it is not it's absolutely every witness statement in these um, horrible murders that they say that person was absolutely not themselves. And leading up to these crimes, um, there's a series of events, and they always talk about certain, you know, it's almost like code words, or it's almost like um, there's always a name mentioned, always. So then it makes you, it's almost like, you know, you go back to certain movies like Paranormal Activity and stuff. Um, that sometimes truth is stranger than fiction in those cases. So I'm going to be studying up on that, and especially when it comes to the Atchison case, because I've also lived um, in places that have been extremely haunted. But my house in New York, for instance, which had nine nine stabbings throughout history, different timelines too, different areas. It wasn't all, it wasn't within a few years. It was within like 100 years or more, probably more because that house was really old. Um, and so obviously those people were influenced but was it an energy that had sustained in the same place over time? Or was it connected to the house, the location, the land? Um, was that place a sort of vortex, possibly? I think a lot more research needs to go into those things instead of just so my focus in the future on these places is going to be more geared towards things like that opposed to just going and seeing what ghosts we can communicate with, what the wow factor, like the jump factor, because um, if you have the gift of communicating with spirits, and yet you quite literally, this opens up an entire new, you could target specific like geniuses throughout history. Say I wanted to know, like, why are we asking simple questions? Why are we saying, go play with a ball or go knock on a door or something? Why are we doing that when we have access to an unlimited universe of information? Why aren't we asking the correct questions? Um, you know, if I could communicate with Einstein, for instance, or Nikola Tesla, w- why would I not ask them how, how something's made, how the universe works, how opposed to asking some like very elementary question just for entertainment purposes. Um, and so moving forward, that's what I hope to do. And that also brings up another situation because I've been asked this a lot lately, and it comes up a lot in the art world. Um, as far as you'll see it throughout time, people talk about um, whether it be in writing, in poetry, in art, in musical composition, in anything of that matter, in electronics, in different any discovery, any scientific discovery, any invention, people talk about somebody stealing their work and or copying them or whatever. And yes, of course, in some cases that might be true. But in other cases, especially with the connectedness of people nowadays in the collective and how that's why all of our consciousness is so synchronistic. Um, hello, Canon. Is it Canon? Canon? I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that. Um, from Chile. Oh, um, these collective consciousness. So, and it's become very apparent nowadays, especially with the use of internet, where you'll see, like, I'll paint something, for instance, and then a few days later, you'll see every artist across the internet had the same idea to paint, I don't know, with a tulip with a frog or something on it. And they're all different to an extent, but the same idea. And then of course here comes all of these different psychics and intuitives and tarot readers and mediums and stuff saying someone stole their idea or someone took their information or all of this. Could be because a thought is energy that you put out in the universe. Once you write that down, it's already in play. It's already out there. Once you have that thought, it's already out there. Every time you get a new idea that has energy behind it, that has passion behind it, that is put out into the universe. So, um, It's like when you go blow on a dandelion and all the little spores go out into the air, and you, I mean, the wind could carry them forever. For that matter, after the wind stops carrying it, a bird could pick it up and carry it, however far, or drop it in the ocean, and then a fish could carry it to the other side of the world. So, um, as far as information being put out there, yes. That's why but people should never worry about like their information being stolen or whatever. I mean, there's a difference in being. I'm not referring to copyright stuff and things like that. I'm referring to like your thoughts, your actions, your intentions, manifestations, things like that. Because one, what is meant for you will always be, but also, um, ooh, that's a good question. I'll get to that in just a second. But also, here's the thing. Everybody's an individual. No one's work is going to be 100%, even if it's copied, no one's work is going to be 100% the same. I don't care if someone cloned you, 50 times, nothing is going to be the same as the original. The original will always be unique. It's like you can't have colored glass and pass it off as a real crystal. The the original will always stand out, like diamonds or anything else. There's obviously, you know, ways to tell what's fake and what's real. So keep that in mind. Now, and it says, what if all the UFO phenomena were actually manifestations of extraterrestrial AI, not alien itself? I'm trying to I'm trying to do better in the chat room so you all know so I can pay attention to this. Um, what do you mean by that? Are you referring to so for instance, when I have a good example of this. When I lived in Manhattan, although back then I was very religious, I was um, a very big participating member of my church, things like that. Um, and I started seeing almost battles of like angels and demons in the sky, in the clouds. And I took pictures. I'll have to go back and get a lot of these. I took pictures of a lot of these, and it's very apparent. It's not just me that, like, if you look at the picture, you can see these things. And um, that's a good question because then it's been reported numerous times that these things can create holographic images in clouds to make a person think they see different shapes or designs or symbols or whatever. And that's been depicted throughout history too. I mean, look at Joan of Arc, things like that. She had similar things happen. And um so yes, I can see that. And if that to me, that was more it wasn't like something trying to communicate with me telepathically in my mind. It was like literally a computer, something projecting that into the sky. So yes, as far as UFOs possibly being the same thing, I think so. Um, I mean, I think it could be both actually. Uh, extraterrestrial artificial intelligence. Oh yeah, absolutely. And there's been so that's also what happens when, there's been a lot of experiencers, abductees, whatever you want to call it, who have 100% stated, even as far as myself goes, um, now they don't necessarily have to take you out of your bed, out of your room, out of your house, whatever, you know, they can project your consciousness. Um, all, same concept as astral projection into another environment. Absolutely. Um, and it wouldn't, I don't think it's necessarily the same as an intelligent robot, although that brings up a whole other world of possibilities, um, which is scary when you think about the future of, even Elon Musk has warned about artificial intelligence because eventually that could form, um, into an intelligent being which has a consciousness on its own without human or extraterrestrial or whatever control, without something outside of itself controlling it. And I have a story about that as well in the future. Um, oh wow, a few weeks ago, NASA probably halo ported some doctors to the ISS. Yes, I believe it, and that's similar to remote viewing. Oh, absolutely. And that also brings up the time travel theory, that it is not actually your body that travels through space or time, it's your consciousness. And a lot of psychics and mediums are able to do that, and that's how we can go back in time or into the future or whatever, because you pick a target date, much like a target person, to for remote viewing and things like that, and you go to that date or that time or that energy of what happened during that period. Say I wanted to know something that happened, I don't know, 50 years ago at a specific location, that would be my target, and you literally project your consciousness to that energy. So that's a great question. Unfortunately, we are out of time. I can't, and I babble. Y'all let me babble for 2 hours here on these things. Um, I want to get more into these things in the future. I'm trying to get more organized. I want to have a lot more of chat room interaction. I love it when people ask questions. Obviously, when I have a guest, I'm just now learning how to use the whole StreamYard platform. And so I want you all to be able to ask me questions. I also want to hear what kind of content you want me to cover. Um, so in the future, if you have specific subjects um, that you want me to research or tell you about our channel or things like that, I would be happy to do that. You can email me at the missing piece, PEACE, with Trish at gmail.com, or you can find me on Facebook or Instagram, The Missing Piece with Trish Mo. Um, thank you all for listening. I did have an announcement. I have resigned from Chasing Prophecy just to to have more time to follow my own path and focus on the missing piece now that it's a 2-hour show, and have um, get more into that as well as just timeless in my life. And so I wish them all the best. I love all of them. um, that was very weird. My computer just completely closed on its own. Anyways, yes, you're welcome, and thank you for chatting, for being active in the chat room. Kanan said it was nice to watch you live and hear your commentaries about the phenomena and question and answer. So yeah, I would love to do more of that. And occasionally I'll have guest co-hosts on, and things like that. Um, but until then, next week, join me with Flood and his crew from XP Planet, and Jill Weaver as well. So we're all going to finally get together and chime in on the, you know, our conclusions of the Sally House. So until then, also head over to my other, my new YouTube channel, Tayama Trishmo, where I'm going to have a lot of different, I guess different things that, especially for like um, healing recipes, fitness tips, things like that. Since I do have Lyme disease and inflammation, um, so that's a new thing for me. Obviously, I just finished that. I will have my website live this week. Um, and see you all next week. Have a great oh my goodness. I'm also going to do probably channeling, maybe even go live for on Sunday. We have this super um let's see, May is the flower full moon, but it's also a super blood moon. And that means the last one was in the fall. So that would have been the fall equinox, the blue moon. So this one is actually equivalent, almost like the blue moon, but it's called the super blood moon, and that will be Sunday. So that's exciting. And then of course, um, join me on Horsefly Chronicles at 7 p.m. Central Time on Monday, and then follow up with my show 8 p.m. Central Time next Monday as well. Have a good night. Thank you for listening.